For years, I thought aperture was the only spec that mattered. Bigger mirror, better views. Simple. Then, I compared two 6-inch scopes on the same target, and my brain broke. Same aperture, wildly different results. The culprit? A number that nobody talks about. Today, we're talking about focal length, here on Night Sky Voyager. When you start looking for a telescope, you'll find a long list of specifications. Weight, size, design, but generally only 2 of those numbers are deemed important enough to be printed right on the tube: aperture and focal length. And sometimes you'll only even see aperture. If you haven't seen my deep dive on aperture yet, check that one out, the card's in the corner. There's a saying that aperture is king. And it's true. Aperture gets all the attention because it brings the visual pop. It's the celebrity. But if aperture is the celebrity, focal length is the manager, the one quietly running the show behind the scenes. It's the man behind the curtain moment. Not flashy, but quietly pulling the levers. And because it isn't flashy, it's easy to overlook. However, the truth is, focal length fundamentally shapes how a telescope performs, its strengths and weaknesses, how it feels to use, and even how your eyepieces behave. It's the hidden architecture of performance, the framework that defines how your telescope shows you the universe. By the end of this video, you won't just understand focal length, you'll feel what it does. Now, let's be the little dog that tugs the curtain open to see what's really going on. In my 15 years of using telescopes, I've made an observation. When people see your setup, they almost always guess the size of the objective, the aperture. But in all that time, I don't think I've ever had anyone walk up and lead with a question about focal length. Tell me in the comments, have you memorized the focal lengths of your telescope? It's not that it never comes up. It does. But it's rarely the first thing people ask. Aperture is what sells a telescope. It's what we daydream about. I think I would drop dead on the spot if someone ever said, "You know what I really want? Just a little more focal length." If focal length gets mentioned at all, it's usually by seasoned observers or someone doing the math on magnification in their head. But if you bring it up with someone newer in the hobby, their eyes usually glaze over. It's just not intuitive as aperture. With aperture, the idea of bigger equals brighter equals more detail clicks instantly. Focal length feels more abstract, and in many cases, it's literally hidden from view. Let me show you what I mean. But before I do, if you like the content I'm creating, please consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. These are 2 of my telescopes, Small Fry and Long John. And setting the unique aspects of their designs aside for a moment, their differing focal lengths make them perform very differently at the eyepiece. Long John is a refractor and has a focal length of about 1200 millimeters, roughly 4 feet. My 6-inch Schmidt-Cass Small Fry, its focal length is 1500 millimeters. And all of that is folded inside this compact design. That longer focal path is invisible, but it completely changes what you see. And before we go any deeper, there's something worth pointing out. Telescopes don't just look different, they behave different. Some naturally present wide, sweeping views. Some gravitate towards tight, high-contrast detail. And some sit comfortably right in the middle. We'll come back to those personalities in a moment, because they'll make the whole focal length story click. Because it's hidden, most people never think about it. But that hidden path is quietly shaping everything you see at the eyepiece. So let's take a look at that invisible architecture. Let's reveal what our telescopes are hiding. Every telescope takes all the light entering its opening and brings it to a single point, the focus. The distance from the lens or mirror to that point is the focal length. It's a simple measurement, but it quietly controls almost everything about how a telescope behaves. Before we get into any of the geometry, let me show you what focal length actually does at the eyepiece. Let's start by establishing the size of the moon. The full moon takes up about half a degree of sky, meaning it would just fit inside an eyepiece with a half-degree true field of view. We're going to simulate the moon through 3 telescopes, where the aperture stays the same, the eyepiece stays the same, but the focal length changes. We'll be using the same 20mm Plossl across all 3 telescopes, because that's what you'd actually do if you were making this comparison in real life. Our 3 telescopes are a Newtonian reflector with a 750mm focal length, my refractor Long John at 1200mm, and my Schmidt-Cass small fry at 1500mm. Let's see what happens. In the shortest focal length telescope, the moon appears smaller, and the sky around it feels wide and open. In the longest focal length telescope, the moon looks larger and takes up almost the entire field of view. The takeaway here is that with the same aperture and the same eyepiece, different focal lengths give you different views. That's focal length at work, quietly shaping everything about your observing experience. Now, we'll look at why this happens. Here, we're looking at a simplified Newtonian reflector from the side. This is a cutaway of a parabolic mirror you'd find in such a telescope. Notice how deep it is. This is a short focal length telescope, and when we trace the rays of light, we can see its focal point and its focal length. Now, let's look at a shallower mirror with a longer focal length. The aperture is the same for both systems. The shallower mirror produces a much longer cone of light. If that focal ratio label feels mysterious, that's okay. It'll make complete sense in the next segment. But the key here is noticing the difference in the cone of light when we change focal length. And here's an easy way to remember it. Wide cone, wide views. Narrow cone, narrow views. And since we can't see that cone forming inside the telescope, I call this the invisible architecture. It's the foundation of focal length. It's the reason 2 telescopes with the same aperture can feel completely different. Okay, that was the geometry behind focal length. Now here's where things get fun. How each telescope feels in use, and the personalities that emerge once you look through them. At a star party, after someone asks about aperture, the next question they might ask is the focal ratio. Focal ratio is simply the focal length divided by the aperture, making sure that you keep the units the same. We use it because it instantly tells you a telescope's personality. It's basically a speed dating profile for telescopes. Fast telescopes, f6 and below, are the wide-eyed explorers. They bring light to focus quickly, creating wide, sweeping views perfect for nebula, the Milky Way, and open clusters. The trade-off is that they're more demanding on eyepieces. But when you're scanning rich star fields, that wide view is intoxicating. Let me give you the moment where it really clicked for me. For several years, I used an f8.3 refractor. It was a great scope, but fairly slow. Then, I built my f4.5 Newtonian and paired it with a wide field eyepiece. Suddenly, I could fit both open clusters of the double cluster in Perseus in the same field. Something my refractor simply couldn't do. It was stunning. It was my first real, oh, that's what a fast scope feels like moment. On the opposite end, slow telescopes, f10 and above, are the precision specialists. They give you narrower, high-contrast views that excel on the moon, planets, and splitting double stars. They're also very forgiving on eyepieces, and they naturally deliver higher magnification. When you need detail, slow wins. Fast versus slow even shapes the telescope itself. You can have a 30-inch Dobsonian at f3, compact, usable, and pointable at the sky, but you'll never see a 30-inch f12 Dob. Unless you want something the height of a grain silo.
It's as big as the grain silo.
This is a Dobsonian telescope, built to bring the entire universe within reach of a small town.
But most telescopes live in the middle. f6 to f10, the jack-of-all-trades range. They're versatile and balanced, with a comfortable natural field of view. Most eyepieces perform well here. If you want one telescope that does a bit of everything, mid-range is your sweet spot. Fast telescopes are the hare. Quick, wide, energetic. Slow telescopes are the tortoise. Steady, focused, patient. But unlike the fable, neither one wins. They're running totally different races. Before we talk about how eyepieces behave in different telescopes, there's one more piece to the focal length puzzle, and it surprised me when I first learned it. Focal length doesn't just change what you see, it changes how bright things look. That comes down to something called the exit pupil, or the size of the beam of light leaving the eyepiece and entering your eye. Short focal length telescopes at the same aperture and with the same eyepiece create a larger exit pupil and brighter low power views. Longer focal length telescopes create a smaller exit pupil and dimmer but more controlled views. For now, just remember, focal length quietly controls both how much sky you see and how bright that sky appears. Now, let's talk about eyepieces, my favorite subject. Eyepieces don't behave the same in every telescope. Your telescope's focal length, and therefore focal ratio, change how an eyepiece performs. Magnification is simply your telescope's focal length divided by the eyepiece's focal length. So, the same eyepiece gives you more magnification in a long focal length telescope and less magnification in a short one. That alone can make the same eyepiece feel totally different. And here's the part that confuses people most. Two telescopes can have the same focal ratio and still behave completely differently. My C8 and my C11 are both f10, but the C11 has a much longer focal length and a larger aperture. So with the same eyepiece, the C11 gives you more magnification, a narrower true field of view, and a brighter, more detailed image because of the extra aperture. Focal ratio, though, adds another layer in the form of eyepiece performance. A fast telescope sends light into the eyepiece at steeper angles, which is harder on eyepiece designs, and tends to reveal more edge distortion, coma, and astigmatism, especially with simpler or budget eyepieces. A slow telescope is much more forgiving. Even simple eyepiece designs often look clean and sharp. This is why a simple Kellner can look great at f12, but not so great at f4.5. The same eyepiece can behave completely differently depending on the telescope you put it in. And this is just scratching the surface. Eyepieces are a huge subject, and that's why I've turned them into their own mini-series coming soon on Night Sky Voyager. So, where does this leave us? Focal length isn't just a number printed on the side of your telescope tube. It's the invisible architecture that shapes how your telescope behaves. It decides how much sky you see at once, how bright that sky looks, how your eyepieces perform, and how the telescope feels to use. Once you learn to read that invisible structure, you can look at any telescope, in a catalog, in a YouTube review, or out on the field at a star party, and have a pretty good idea of how it will feel at the eyepiece before you ever look through it. And now that you understand focal length, those personalities make a lot more sense. The wide-eyed explorer, the jack of all trades, and the precision specialist. They don't behave that way by accident. Their focal length is the invisible architecture shaping every strength, every weakness, and every view they show you. And we're just getting started. In my upcoming Eyepiece mini-series, we'll dive deeper into apparent and true field of view, eye relief, distortion, exit-pupil, and why some eyepieces cost more than the telescope that they're in. If this video helped you understand your telescope a little better, or gave you a new way to think about focal length, give this video a like. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what focal length your main telescope is and what kind of observing you enjoy the most. Thank you so much for watching. This is Trevor with Night Sky Voyager, wishing you clear skies.